Hello everyone, welcome to one more episode of Quantum Tutorials. This is a continuation video to the playlist that we are creating on microapps style of building applications using Visualizer and Fabric. In this video, we'll look at the Visualizer side of things. As part of this video, we are going to create few microapps in Visualizer and link them together as part of a composite app and build an end-to-end application inside Visualizer. To start with, here we are creating a resources microapp. The name suffixed with MA indicates a microapp. It is just a naming convention. So this resources microapp that we are creating will hold all the resources that are required in various microapps in my composite application, meaning all the assets that are required by multiple microapps that will be linked to my composite app, I'll be placing as part of this resources microapp. As you can see here, I'm putting the logo, the image that I want to use as the header image in various micro apps. I am putting that as part of this resources micro app. Except for the resources, we will not create any forms or templates or skins or components, any other elements as part of this micro app. So we will use this resources micro app just to hold all the assets that are required by other micro apps that will be linked to my composite application. Here we are creating the second micro app, naming Commons micro app, Commons MA. The intention is to have all the skins, themes, templates, components, the reusable elements which can be used in any of the other micro apps that will be linked to my composite app as part of this Commons MA. So all the reusable elements like themes, skins, templates, components will be creating as part of this Commons MA micro app. Here we'll start with creating some of the skins inside the application. All these skins that we are creating as part of this Commons MA micro app will be shared and used by other micro apps that will be linked to the composite application. As we proceed with the video, we will look at how we can link the Commons micro app and resources micro app as dependencies to other micro apps, and how we can share the resources from these Commons micro app and resources micro app to the other micro applications. Here we are creating the various skins for different widgets that we'll be using as part of various micro apps inside this project. So we are creating the skins for various widgets like the labels, text boxes, buttons, flex containers, and other elements that we'll be using for creating the UI layouts in various screens in various micro apps as part of this project. Now that we have created the required skins, now let us create the components that are reusable across various micro apps. We will start with creating the header component that will be reused across the forms that we will create in various micro applications. In this Commons MA, we will not have any forms or any modules created. The Commons MA micro app will only hold the reusable elements like the themes, skins, templates, and components. Similar to the resources micro app was holding all the reusable assets inside it, Commons MA will hold all the reusable UI elements inside it. So these two micro apps will not have any forms or JavaScript modules related to the forms created inside them. As you can see here, we are creating the form header component. It is a component without contract. It will have a logo at the center of the header. As you can see here, the image that we want to show as part of this image widget, the PNG file, is not present inside this Commons MA micro app. It is part of the resources MA micro app. So now we will see how we can add the resources MA micro app as a dependency to this Commons MA micro app. Using this option, link micro apps from my workspace, I will be able to link the micro app resources MA which is present in my workspace to this Commons MA micro app that is currently opened. So we are adding the resources MA micro app as a dependency to the Commons MA micro app, so that we can share the assets that are part of a resources MA micro app with the Commons MA micro app, and we can use those images as part of Commons MA micro app. So now we have added resources MA micro app as a dependency to the Commons MA micro app. As you can see here, Visualizer will show all the apps that are linked together. So using this option, manage micro apps, you will be able to share the resources from the resources MA micro app to Commons MA micro app. So click on this context menu and use share resources option. So once you enable this option, all the resources that are part of resources MA micro app will be shared with the commons MA micro app, as the commons MA micro app is having the resources MA micro app as a dependency. So now we have enabled that sharing. Let's go to the header component that we are creating, and if we try to search for the PNG file which is part of resources MA, we will be able to look at this PNG file, and we will be able to use this PNG file as part of the header component which we are creating inside the commons MA micro app. So this is how you can add one micro app as a dependency to another micro app, and then you can enable resource sharing so that one micro app can use the resources present as part of another micro app. So now the header component is ready. We have created a component without contract for the header component inside commons MA micro app, which is using the logo PNG file which is present as part of resources MA micro app. Now we are creating few templates under the segments. These templates that we are creating here inside the template section of commons micro app, we will be using them in other micro apps which will contain forms that will have segments inside them. So on those forms, for the segment widgets, for assigning the row template and the section header template, we will be using these templates that we are creating as part of this commons MA micro app. So the commons MA micro app, as the name suggests, it will have all the reusable UI elements, the themes, set of skins, and the reusable UI components and the reusable UI templates. All these we are creating as part of this commons MA micro app. So we will use them in other micro apps at various forms inside the other micro apps. As we proceed with the video, we will understand how we can use those. It is similar to how we linked the resources MA micro app as a dependency to the commons MA micro app, and by enabling resource sharing on the resources MA micro app, we are able to share the resources from that resources MA micro app into the commons MA micro app. So here we are creating the section header template for the segment widget. Now we are creating a row template for the segment widget. So the intention is we'll create an accounts micro app shortly, and inside that accounts microapp visualizer project, we will add this commons MA as a dependency, and we will be using these templates on the segment widget that we will have on a form inside the accounts MA microapp to show the list of accounts. So till now, as part of this Commons MA micro app, we have created a component for the form header, and we have created a couple of templates for the segments. Now we are creating one more component. This time we are creating a component with contract, and as part of this component we want to create the login component, which will have the username and password text boxes and the login button. And this login component, we want to expose it as a component with contract, where we'll expose few properties, few events and few methods from this component, so that the consumer of the component can use those properties, events and methods and define the behavior of the component. So as part of this login component, it's not just the UI that we are creating. Instead, we'll encapsulate the entire login functionality of calling the identity service and getting the response from the identity service as part of this login component. Let's first create the UI for this login component. we have almost created the login component UI, which is having a couple of text boxes, one for the username, another for the password, and the login button. And we also have options for remember me and forgot password. So this is the simple login UI that we have created. Now, in the next steps, let us see how we can define component level properties, component level events, and component level methods using these options in the properties. By using the manage events, manage methods, manage properties, we will be able to create component level events, methods, and properties. Here we are defining the custom event login success callback. This custom event will be raised once the login service call, the identity service call is successful. The actions to be performed as part of this event will be configured by the consumer of this component, which is inside another micro app where we will be using this component, login component. The other micro app will define the actions to be performed as part of this login success callback custom event that is defined on this login component. Similarly, we are defining the login failure callback. We are grouping these two custom events into a group called login component events. So there are two custom events that we have defined on this login component, login success callback and login failure callback. Here we are defining a custom method on the login component. Using this custom method, the consumer of the component will be able to read the state of the remember me checkbox, so that post login success, the consumer of this login component will be able to know whether the remember me checkbox is selected or not, based on which the consumer of this component can save the username with which the login is successful into the local storage. Basically, now we have defined a couple of events and one method on this login component. The method will be used by the consumer of the component to know the status of the remember me checkbox, whether it is checked or unchecked. Let us open the controller associated with this login component. This is how the controller associated with this login component looks like. Inside this component's controller, we are going to write the logic to invoke the identity service and get the response back. Based on the response, whether it is successful or fail, we will be invoking or in fact raising the custom events that we have defined. Before that, here we are defining a custom property on the login component. With this custom property, the consumer of the login component can provide the name of the identity service that the login component needs to invoke. So it's a custom property that we are defining at the login component level. Identity service name. The intention of this custom property is to give a handle to the consumer of this component to specify the name of the identity service that should be invoked by this login component. As you can see here, once we have defined this custom property on the login component, the getters and setters for this custom property on the login component are auto generated. As we have defined the custom method on this login component, let us define the logic for that custom method. So this custom method is responsible to return the state of the remember me checkbox so that the consumer of the component will be able to know the state of the remember me checkbox and do the appropriate action. So for every custom method that you define at the component level, inside the components controller, you'll have to define the implementation of that custom method. In this simple custom method, we are looking at the selected key of the remember me checkbox that we have on the UI, and we are returning the state of the selected key. If there is something selected in the checkbox, we will return true or else we will return false. It is always recommended to put the appropriate comments and log statements while you are defining your implementation methods. Here we are showing how we can edit the linter rules that come along with the Visualizer IDE. So using the linter, you can define the linter rules at the project level and also at the workspace level. So using this Visualizer Quantum Visualizer IQ, you will be able to browse through the default linter rules and you will be able to edit them. Here we are defining another function inside the login components controller, and using this function we want to invoke the identity service and get the response back from the identity service call. Based on whether the response is successful or failure, we would raise the appropriate custom events that we have defined on this login component. The actions to be performed on those custom events will be defined at the consumer level, but the login functionality itself is encapsulated as part of this login components, this particular function that we are defining here. So this is how you will be able to define a component with contract and encapsulate some functionality as part of that component and expose some events, properties and methods for the consumer of the component to consume them and define the behavior of the component. We are using the custom property identity service name to get the value of the identity service name that is passed by the consumer of the component, and using that we are getting the reference of the identity service that is available in the Fabric app and invoking the login operation on that identity service. We are using the login function on the identity service reference, and we are invoking the login functionality on the identity service. As you can see here, we are invoking a couple of local functions as the success callback and the error callback. The first parameter to this login function is the name of the identity service that we want to invoke, and then we are passing the input parameters for that identity service call, and the last two parameters are the success callback and the failure callback. So these are local methods that we are defining now. From these local methods, we'll be invoking the custom events, or in fact, we'll be raising the custom events that are defined on this component for success callback and the login failure callback. The actual actions to be performed as part of that success callback and failure callback will be defined by the consumer of the component. So from this local method that we have created for the login success callback, we are raising the custom event, login success custom event that is defined at the login component level. Similarly, we are doing the same for the handling of the failure callback. A local method is defined from which we are raising the custom event login failure that is defined at the component level. So we have defined the login functionality as part of this login component. The entire invoking the identity service, getting the response back from the identity service, and calling the login success callback or the login failure callback is encapsulated as part of this login components functionality. So now we have completed creating the Commons MA micro app containing the reusable UI elements like the skins, themes, templates, and the components. In the next step, let us see how we can create the Authentication MA micro app and link this Commons MA and Resources MA micro apps as dependent apps to that Authentication MA micro app, and use the elements that we have defined as part of Commons MA micro app and Resources MA micro app inside the Authentication micro app. So the Authentication micro app would have the login functionality implemented inside it. Now that we have created the Commons micro app and the Resources micro app, let us start creating the Authentication MA micro app. And this Authentication micro app will have dependency as Commons micro app. Here I am creating the Authentication micro app. Once we have created the Authentication micro app, let us link the Commons micro app as a dependency to this Authentication micro app. Once you have linked the Commons micro app to the Authentication micro app, let us enable the resource sharing on the Commons micro app so that the Authentication micro app can use the resources that are present as part of Commons micro app, that is the templates, skins, components, themes that we have created as part of Commons micro app are shared with Authentication micro app. So this is how we will be able to link micro apps as dependent micro apps to another micro app, and then enable resource sharing so that the other micro app, in this case authentication micro app, is able to use all the resources which are present as part of commons micro app. Once you have enabled the resource sharing from the commons micro app into authentication micro app, let's create the login screen inside the authentication micro app by using the login component, which is part of commons micro app. As you can see, the form FRM login is part of authentication micro app, and the login component inside this form is present as part of commons micro app, and we are able to use that login component for creating the login screen. Let's adjust the layout for this login screen. After adjusting the layout, let us define the properties for this login component. Remember, we have exposed one property on the login component, a couple of events on the login component, and a method on the login component. We can define the values for these properties and the events that are defined on the login component. So now authentication micro app is the consumer of the login component, and from this authentication micro app we will be defining the values of the properties and events that are exposed on the login component. Let us link the authentication micro app in Visualizer to the authentication micro app that we have created in Fabric. And the identity service that is part of the Fabric authentication micro app, the name of the identity service we are giving as a value of the custom property identity service name that is exposed by the login component, so that the login component's controller can use the value provided for the identity service name, and he can do the authentication or invocation of the login service call from the login component's controller to the Fabric identity service. Now let us implement the success callback and the failure callback for the identity service call. So the actions that need to happen on the success callback and the failure callback of the identity service call, those actions we are defining inside the controller of this login form, and these functions that we are defining in the controller of the login form, we will assign them as the values for the custom events that are exposed by the login component. So the consumer, in this case the authentication micro app, is defining the actions that need to happen in the success callback and the failure callback of the identity service call, and these actions are provided as values to the custom events that are exposed by the login component. The simple action that we are doing in the success callback and the failure callback is to show an alert whether login is successful or whether login is failed. Once you have defined these two functions in the controller of the FRM login form, let us link these functions or let us invoke these functions in the custom events for the login component. So the custom events of the login component are grouped under login component events section, and we are invoking the functions that we are defined as part of the form controller. So this is a simple example in which we created a micro app with a specific functionality, that is to log in or the authentication functionality, and we are using the login component defined inside another micro app, which is commons micro app, and by passing the appropriate values to the custom properties and custom events exposed by that component, we are able to consume that component from this authentication micro app. Let us generate the build for this authentication micro app project and see whether the login functionality is working correctly or not. The build is generated. Let us enter the user ID and password and test the login functionality. When we click on login, nothing happens. This is because we did not link the login function to the on-click event of this login button in the component that we have created as part of Commons micro app. Let's link the login function that we have created in the components controller to the on-click event of the login button inside the component. Right. So now the login function that we have defined as part of the login controller, the components controller, is linked to the on-click event of this login button. Now if we generate the build for the authentication micro app, so we should be able to test the login functionality. Let's generate the build once again. And test the login functionality. As you can see, we get the response as login success. That means using the values that we are passing to the custom properties and custom events defined on the login component from the authentication micro app, the Commons micro app's login component is able to invoke the identity service call and perform the identity service call successfully. Now that we have created the authentication micro app, let us create the accounts micro app, which will have the functionality of fetching the list of accounts associated with the logged in user and displaying them on the segment widget in a form. Creating the accounts micro app. Once you have created the accounts micro app, link the commons micro app as a dependency to this accounts micro app, so that you can use the templates that you have created as part of commons micro app inside this accounts micro app. Linking the commons micro app to the accounts micro app now. Once the commons micro app is linked as a dependent micro app to the accounts micro app, now let us enable resource sharing from the commons micro app into the accounts micro app. Go to the micro app settings, enable resource sharing on the commons micro app that is linked to this accounts micro app. Once you have enabled resource sharing from the commons micro app into the accounts micro app, now you will be able to use all the skins, themes, templates and components that you have created as part of commons micro app or the forms that you create inside the accounts micro app. Applying the skin for the form that we have created in the accounts micro app. Now let's use the header. The header component is part of commons micro app and we are using it inside the form that we have created as part of accounts micro app. Now let's create a segment widget inside which we will display the list of accounts associated with the logged in user. So on the form that you have inside the accounts micro app, create a segment widget and design the segment widget using the templates that you have created inside commons micro app. Here we have created the segment widget using the templates that we have as part of commons micro app. Now let us implement the function using which we can fetch the list of accounts associated with the logged in user by invoking the integration service that is part of authentication micro app inside the fabric layer. For this, we are implementing a function inside the form controller in the form that is present as part of accounts micro app. From this function, we will get the reference of the current SDK instance and then the reference of integration services and we will invoke the operation that we have created as part of our integration service. Let us link this accounts micro app in Visualizer with the accounts micro app that we have created inside the fabric layer. Once you have linked the accounts micro app in Visualizer with the accounts micro app that we have created inside the fabric layer, let us implement the functionality to invoke the integration service inside this fabric app and get the list of accounts associated with the logged in user. We are getting the reference of the integration service, and then using the reference of the integration service, we are invoking the operation inside that integration service. Now that we have defined the function to invoke the integration service from the accounts form controller, let us define the success callback and the error callback that should get invoked when the integration service is invoked successfully versus if there is any error while invoking the integration service. So we are defining these two functions inside the FRM accounts controller, and these two functions are responsible for handling the success callback and the error callback. So inside the success callback of the integration service call, once we get the list of accounts, we are mapping the list of accounts to the segment widget which is there on the form. We do the widget data map, and then we do the set data to show the data onto the segment widget which is there on the form. In every integration service success callback, we'll have to check whether the response object is null or not, and then we'll have to check for the op status in the response object. Only if the op status value is 0, that means the response is successfully returned from the fabric layer, and then we can start processing the response object. Any non-zero value for op status parameter in the response object indicates an error has happened inside the fabric layer, and appropriately you will have to handle the user experience on the front end application. So here we are preparing the array of arrays structure so that we can feed this structure to the segment widget, and the segment widget can show the list of accounts grouped into account categories, that is the list of accounts grouped into sections. So as you can see here, we are preparing the array of array structure, and each sub array contains a JSON object as the first element, and the second element will be an array containing the list of records that we want to show as part of that specific section. So this function to fetch the list of accounts by invoking the integration service call is being invoked in the init event of this form. So while this form renders for the first time, the function will get invoked as part of the init event, and from this function an integration service call is made to Fabric, and the list of accounts associated with the logged in user are fetched, and they are displayed onto the segment which we have on the form. So this is how we are able to create one more micro app, accounts micro app, having the accounts functionality present inside it. So we have 4 micro apps on the visualizer side now. The resources micro app containing all the assets that we want to bundle as part of the front end application, and those assets which are reused across the multiple micro apps that we have inside the visualizer side, and the commons micro app which contain all the reusable UI elements like the skins, themes, templates and components which are used across other micro apps inside the front end visualizer side. And we have created the authentication micro app and for defining the login functionality of the application. And the authentication micro app is reusing the UI elements that are part of commons micro app and resources micro app. And we also created one more micro app, accounts micro app, in which we created a form and a segment widget inside it. And this accounts micro app is responsible for handling the accounts functionality inside the application. Now let us define the navigation between the accounts micro app and the authentication micro app. From the overall application perspective, when the end user accesses our application, the login screen is shown to the end user, and once the login is successful, currently we are just displaying an alert message showing the status of the login service call. But in the real time, we want to navigate to the accounts form that is present inside the accounts micro app once the login is successful. We have this navigation manager concept introduced along with the micro app style of creating applications inside visualizer. Using this navigation manager, we will be able to define the various navigations that need to happen on every form. Here in the navigation manager, we will have a JSON file and a JS file. In the JSON file, we define the navigations that can happen from one form to another form. It can be intra navigation in between the micro apps, or it can be inter navigation in between the forms of the same micro app. As you can see here, in the authentication micro app, after the login is successful, from the login screen present in the authentication micro app, we want to navigate to the accounts form present in the accounts micro app. So we defined the configuration as shown here in the JSON file, defining the navigation from the login form of the authentication micro app to accounts form in the accounts micro app. Once we have defined the JSON configuration in the JSON file, now we are defining the function that will handle these navigations. To this function, we will be passing the data object, and depending on the keys that are present inside the data object, in various scenarios we can have different keys present inside this data object, and in this case, depending on whether the login success key is present inside the data object, we are returning the app name and the form's friendly name. In this case, accounts micro app is the app name and FRM accounts is the form inside the accounts micro app. So we are creating a navigation from the authentication micro app form login to accounts micro app form accounts. Now that we have defined this JSON object and the JavaScript function inside the JS file, let us look at in the success callback of the login, how do we create this navigation manager object and pass the data object to navigate from the login form of authentication micro app to accounts form in the accounts micro app. So using this API coney.mbc.get navigation manager, we get the reference of the navigation manager, and using the function navigate on the navigation manager, we will be able to navigate between the forms of the same micro app or in between the forms of various micro apps. Here the data object that we are passing as an input parameter to the navigate API is being created with the context as the first input parameter and params as the second input parameter. So the login success key that we are referring in the data object inside the JS file, this is where we are creating it and we are passing it as part of params key. So in the micro apps style of building apps, this is a new way of navigation between the forms of the same micro app or navigation between the forms of different micro apps. Now we are creating a composite app and we will link the accounts micro app and authentication micro app into it. The suffix CA indicates it's a composite micro app. Again, that's just the naming convention. And inside this composite micro app, we are not going to create any forms or JS modules or templates or themes or skins or components, but we are going to link the other micro apps into this composite micro app, which means the authentication micro app and the accounts micro app are being linked into this composite micro app. Once we have linked the individual micro apps into this composite micro app, we are also linking the composite fabric app that we have created to this composite visualizer app that we have created. So in this composite app, we have not explicitly created any forms or JS modules or templates or skins or themes or components, but we have linked the individual microapps into this composite microapp, and let's make the login form as the startup form. The login form which is present as part of authentication microapp, let us make it as a startup form. As you can see here, the individual microapps, accounts microapp is linked to the accounts microapp in Fabric, authentication microapp is linked to the authentication microapp in Fabric, and the composite app is linked to the composite app inside Fabric. Let us make this login form as the startup form, and let us build the application and test this application. So we are building a composite app now, which will launch the login form inside the authentication microapp as a startup form. And once the login is successful, it will navigate to the accounts form present as part of accounts microapp using the navigation configuration that we have defined inside the authentication microapp. So the build is completed, and we can see the login screen is launched as the startup screen, and when we enter the username and password and when we click on login, let's debug this application and look at the logs as well. Click on resume to resume the application launch. Enter the valid username and password and click on login. As you can see, the login is successful, the identity service call is successful, and it automatically navigated to the accounts form in the accounts microapp. And the list of accounts are fetched and displayed inside the accounts form in the accounts microapp. If we open this same application from the browser, we will be able to see that the login form is opened, which is part of authentication microapp and the login form. And when we enter the username and password and click on login, using the navigation manager configurations that we have created, if the login service call is successful, from the success callback, we are navigating to the accounts microapp accounts form. So from the authentication microapp login form, we are navigating to the accounts microapp accounts form. And in the init event of this accounts form, the integration service call is made to fetch the list of accounts, and they are displayed inside the segment widget that is there on this form. So this is how we will be able to create multiple micro apps having specific functionality defined inside them, and we can create a composite app by linking multiple micro apps together, and by using the navigation manager we can define the navigations between the forms of the various micro apps. Thank you.